It was a crisp autumn morning in the quiet village of Belmare, the kind of morning where the mist hung low and the world still felt half asleep. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Roosters crowed in the distance, smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the villagers went about their routines as they always had. But by nightfall, whispers of something strange had already begun to stir. For nuns, Sister Marianne, Sister Judith, Sister Eloise, and Sister Celine were missing. No one had seen them leave the convent. No one heard a thing. It was like they had vanished into thin air. What makes this story truly haunting isn't just the disappearance itself, it's the silence that followed. There were no leads, no signs of struggle, no answers. And in a town as small and tight-knit as Belmare, that kind of mystery doesn't just fade away. It settles deep in the bones of the place. Over the years, stories were passed down, each more unsettling than the last. Some said the nuns had run off. Others claimed something more sinister. The woods behind the convent, already known for strange happenings, became the focus of countless rumors. But as time went on, the trail went cold, and the case was quietly closed. At the center of the convent was Father Benedict, the village priest. He had known those women not just as fellow servants of faith, but as friends. For years, he carried the burden of their disappearance like a weight on his soul. He stayed at the convent, even as others left. He kept their rooms untouched, their rosaries hung neatly on the wall, their prayer books still open to the last page they had read. To him, it was never truly over. Something about the way they disappeared just never made sense. And in his heart, he believed that one day, the truth would come to light. 28 years passed. By then, the world had moved on. New families moved into Belmare. Children grew up hearing only fragments of the story. The old convent had become something of a forgotten relic, still standing but mostly ignored. Father Benedict, now elderly and weathered, remained in the village. People often said he looked like a man chasing ghosts. But what no one knew was that he never stopped searching. Quietly, in the background, he kept going through old records, old letters, and any scrap of memory that could lead him somewhere, anywhere. Then one rainy evening, something changed. A letter arrived. No return address. No name. Just an old, faded envelope that looked like it had traveled through time. Inside was a single photograph. It was grainy, taken with an old film camera, but the faces were unmistakable. The four nuns, standing together, alive. And behind them, carved into the wall of what looked like a cave, was a symbol. One Father Benedict recognized immediately, an ancient religious mark, one he hadn't seen since his seminary days. A symbol often tied to old monastic orders that had long since disappeared. Shaken, he kept the photo hidden and began his own investigation, more determined than ever. He didn't want to raise false hopes or bring unwanted attention to the village. But in his gut, he knew this wasn't just a prank. The photo had a date scribbled on the back, March 12, 1994. That was 14 years after the nuns had disappeared, which meant, if the photo was real, they had been alive for at least that long. The question was, where had they been? He started by revisiting the places they had once frequented. The woods, the old chapel on the hill, the now dilapidated barn behind the convent. And slowly, piece by piece, something began to emerge. People started remembering little details they hadn't thought were important back then. A candle seen flickering in the woods late at night, strange humming sounds during storms, and the odd sighting of a figure in white robes near the river. What was most chilling was a diary entry he came across in the convent's attic. It was written by Sister Eloise just days before they vanished. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic, and the words were unlike anything Father Benedict had ever seen from her. She wrote of vivid dreams, strange chanting in the middle of the night, and a feeling that something ancient had awakened. She didn't name what it was, but she ended the entry with a line that sent chills down his spine. If we do not return, it was not by choice. And if we are found, beware. Father Benedict sat alone with that diary, the photo still resting in his lap, rain tapping against the old stained glass windows. He realized then that whatever had happened wasn't just a mystery, it was a warning. Something had drawn those nuns away from their lives, away from the safety of the convent, and it was something they had not understood at the time. Or maybe they had, and that's why they never came back. The more he looked into it, the more disturbing things became. Church records were missing, pages torn from archives, even old homilies had been redacted in places. A pattern emerged. Every mention of an ancient order called Servants of the Silent Light had been scrubbed clean. But in one forgotten book deep in the library basement, he found a reference to them. A secretive sect of nuns who believed in hidden knowledge, who were said to have practiced rituals far removed from the mainstream church. Most historians dismissed them as myth, but the name was familiar because it was written in that same frantic handwriting at the very bottom of Sister Eloise's diary. And now, almost 3 decades later, it seemed they had resurfaced. With his health failing and time slipping away, Father Benedict made a choice. He would return to the forest, to the place he believed held the final piece of the puzzle. He gathered his strength, packed what little he needed, and left a note on his desk. It simply said, "If I don't come back, follow the river at dusk." That was the last time anyone saw him. What he discovered in the days that followed would change everything the village thought it knew about that night in 1980. And when the truth finally came out, it was more shocking, more chilling, and more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. But before we reveal what really happened to the 4 missing nuns, what they became, and why they were never supposed to be found, you need to understand just how far some will go in the name of silence. And what silence, when it lingers long enough, begins to hide. The rain didn't stop for 2 days after Father Benedict vanished. Heavy, cold, and constant, like the sky itself was mourning. A few villagers noticed his absence right away. Mail piling up. Lights off in the rectory. The church bell, which he had always rung at dawn, remained silent. Some thought maybe he had gone to stay with family, but those closest to him knew better. He hadn't left the village in years. He used to say, "This is where I finish what I started." His note was found by Eliza, the church caretaker. She had worked beside him for almost 20 years, cleaning the pews, lighting candles, making sure everything in the old church kept running. She found the letter tucked under a statue of St. Agnes, the same place he once hid messages for the missing nuns during the early days of the investigation. The handwriting was unmistakable. The message was short, almost cryptic, but Eliza understood it right away. She remembered the stories. How Father Benedict would walk the riverbank at dusk, staring into the trees as if listening for something only he could hear. She remembered how he would sometimes stop mid-sermon, staring blankly out the stained glass windows, only to continue preaching like nothing happened. He had always been kind, always gentle, but there was a weight behind his eyes, a knowing. Eliza gathered a few trusted people, those who had lived through the original disappearance in 1980 and still believed there was something unresolved. Among them was Daniel, the village's historian, who had grown up hearing his mother talk about the strange things that happened in the weeks leading up to the vanishing. There was also Margot, once a postulant at the convent who left just 2 months before the nuns disappeared, still haunted by the dreams she had while living there. Together, they followed the river. As they moved deeper into the woods, the air seemed to change. The trees grew thicker, the path narrower. The sounds of the village faded behind them, replaced by the soft trickle of water and the distant call of birds. But it wasn't just that. There was something else, a strange quietness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. About 2 miles in, they found the first sign, a broken rosary, half buried in the mud. Eliza picked it up carefully. It was old, wooden beads faded and worn, but still intact. She recognized it. It had belonged to Sister Marianne. She remembered how Sister Marianne used to fidget with it during prayer, looping it around her fingers like a nervous habit. They pressed on, deeper into the woods. And that's when they found the cave. It wasn't on any map, not even the old ones Daniel carried with him. The entrance was narrow and almost completely covered by ivy, as if nature had been trying to hide it for decades. But inside, the air was cold and still. They moved carefully, flashlights guiding the way, illuminating walls marked with strange symbols and faded paintings. The same symbol that had appeared in the photo, the one behind the nuns, was carved deep into the stone. And then, there was the smell. Not decay, exactly, but something old, like pages from a forgotten book or robes sealed away for years. At the back of the cave, they found a small altar. Candles had burned there recently. Wax still pooled at the base. But what stopped them cold was the discovery beneath the altar, Father Benedict's crucifix. It was unique, handcrafted by a local artist decades ago, with his initials carved on the back. He had been there, but he was no longer alone. Daniel, flipping through his notes, finally shared what he'd found in the archives just days before the priest disappeared. It was an old letter, tucked between pages of a dusty parish registry. The letter had been written in Latin, and it referenced an ancient religious group once active in the region, the Servants of the Silent Light. They were a cloistered order, supposedly formed in the 1600s, focused on isolation, meditation, and what they called the calling beyond voice. There were claims they believed in divine silence, that true communion with the divine could only be achieved when the mind was emptied of all earthly sound and thought. Their members took a vow of complete silence, sometimes for life. But according to the letter, the group had splintered in the early 1900s. A few radical members believed the silence wasn't just metaphorical. They believed it was alive, that there was something in the stillness that could be contacted, called, welcomed. And that's where the convent's history came back into focus. The building had stood for more than a century, but little was known about its earliest occupants. Records were missing or vague. There were mentions of a transformation that occurred sometime in the 1920s, and after that, silence. Literally. No letters sent, no visitors recorded, no diary entries beyond vague reflections. Just quiet. Then, in 1979, 1 year before the nuns vanished, Sister Eloise began researching the origins of the convent. Her writings, now pieced together by Daniel, hinted that she had found something disturbing. Hidden beneath the chapel floorboards, she had discovered a passageway, a tunnel leading to a sealed chamber. What was inside remained unclear, but she wrote of shadows that moved without light, of whispers heard only in the mind. She never told the others, at least, not right away. But her final diary entries hinted that she believed the order had awakened something. Or perhaps, something had never gone to sleep. That summer, each of the 4 nuns began to change. Sister Celine stopped speaking altogether, even during confession. Sister Judith took to walking the halls at night, muttering prayers that made no sense. Sister Marianne reportedly began drawing strange symbols into her bed linens. And Sister Eloise, she stopped attending Mass altogether, spending hours in the basement, saying she was listening. And then, they were gone. No signs of violence. No forced doors. Just silence. Now, nearly 3 decades later, that silence had returned, and it wasn't empty. The group left the cave shaken. They didn't speak much on the way back. Something about the place stuck to them, clung like fog. Eliza carried the rosary in her pocket, fingers wrapped tightly around it. They didn't find Father Benedict, but they all agreed he had found what he was looking for. Back in the village, strange things began happening. The church bells rang one night at 3:07 a.m. No one was inside. Candles relit themselves after being extinguished. One morning, Margot found the altar rearranged, as if prepared for Mass, but no one had the keys. And then came the dreams. Each of them, one by one, began having the same dream. A long hallway, lined with old wooden doors. Behind each door, the sound of whispering. Not in words, but in rhythm, like a chant. At the end of the hallway stood 4 women, faces veiled, eyes closed. They did not speak, but the message was clear. Do not open the door. But the question that remained, what door? And what waited behind it if someone did? There were too many loose ends. Too many pieces that didn't quite fit. But there was one thing Eliza couldn't stop thinking about. The final note in Sister Eloise's journal, half faded but still readable. We went searching for silence. But silence found us first. Whatever had taken the 4 village nuns, whatever had reached out from the quiet, it wasn't finished. And the next part of the story would show just how far it was willing to go to stay hidden. Or maybe, just maybe, it was waiting to be heard. The following week in Belmare was unlike anything the village had experienced in years. The quiet streets that once felt comforting now carried an uneasy stillness, like something just beneath the surface was waiting to rise. Most villagers didn't know the details, only that Father Benedict had disappeared and that Eliza, Daniel, and a few others had gone into the woods looking for him. Whispers traveled quickly in small towns, and by now, nearly everyone had heard some version of the story. But no one wanted to say out loud what they feared might be true, that whatever happened in 1980 wasn't finished. Daniel spent most of his time at the village library, digging deeper into the history of the convent and the so-called servants of the Silent Light. He discovered an old book misfiled in the children's section, its cover missing, its pages fragile with age. Inside were references to rituals, rites meant to connect with the deep quiet, a phrase that came up more than once in the text he had found. One passage stood out. When the voice is gone and thought is still, the silence speaks what words cannot. But only the chosen will hear. He read that line over and over, trying to understand what it meant. What silence was it talking about? And who had chosen the 4 nuns? Meanwhile, Eliza found herself visiting the convent more often. Even though it had long been abandoned, she felt drawn there, as if the place remembered everything and was just waiting for someone to ask the right question. One afternoon, she wandered into the old chapel. Dust floated in the shafts of light coming through the stained glass, and the air felt thicker than it should have. She knelt by the front pew and began to pray, not just for Father Benedict, but for the women who vanished, for the truth, for anything that might make sense of what was happening. She didn't expect an answer, but something happened. A gust of wind passed through the room, though no windows were open. A hymn book on the altar flipped open, pages rustling until they stopped. Page 47. A song that none of the villagers sang anymore. Come quietly, Lord. The lyrics were odd, with references to darkness that welcomes and ears unburdened by sound. Eliza shivered and closed the book. Margot, meanwhile, had begun having visions while awake. Not full hallucinations, but brief flashes, glimpses of shadowy figures walking through the convent halls, flickers of candlelight where there was none, and the overwhelming sense of being watched. One evening, she looked into a mirror and for a split second, thought she saw another face behind her, pale, veiled, and still. But when she turned, the room was empty. She told herself it was stress, or maybe the memories catching up with her. But deep down, she knew something was happening. Something that was slowly pulling her back into a place she had tried to forget. Back in the woods, strange signs began to appear near the cave. Small, handmade wooden crosses. Some hung from trees, others stuck into the ground in perfect rows. No one claimed to have put them there. Local hunters said they started seeing figures at dusk, dressed in white, standing just at the edge of their vision before fading into the trees. One hunter, who had never believed the stories, came into the village pale and shaking. He said he heard singing, soft and distant, and when he followed the sound, he found a clearing filled with candles, lit, but untouched by the wind. The deeper they all looked into the mystery, the more they realized the conflict wasn't just about the missing nuns or the priest. It was about something older, something buried. And it wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a presence. Daniel started connecting events that had long been dismissed as coincidences. A girl who went missing in 1963 for 3 days, only to return with no memory and a strange symbol carved into the bottom of her shoe. A visiting monk who vanished in 1942 after staying at the convent for a single night. Even in the 1800s, when the convent was first established, there were reports of dreams, voices, and sudden silence among the sisters. It was always the same pattern: disorientation, obsession with silence, and then disappearance. But the most chilling discovery came from a weathered letter hidden inside an old family Bible in the church archives. It was written by the original founder of the convent, a woman named Sister Althea, dated 1894. The letter was never sent. It spoke of a lightless presence that had once been sealed beneath the land, and how the convent was built not to worship, but to contain. The silence here is not absence. It is watching, and it is waiting. We must remain faithful, not to the light above, but to the dark beneath. For if it is awakened, none will remember their own voice. Eliza, Daniel, and Margot gathered in the old chapel one night, overwhelmed by the weight of everything they had learned. The question they couldn't shake was this: had the nuns accidentally awakened something, or had they chosen to join it? And what about Father Benedict? Had he gone into the cave to rescue them, or follow? Margot hesitated to share what she'd remembered from her time at the convent all those years ago. She had tried to push the memory down, but it came back clearly now. One night, she had heard the nuns singing in the basement, not hymns, but something else. A strange melody with no words, just tones, rising and falling. She had gone to the top of the stairs and listened. That's when she saw them, moving in a circle, their veils over their faces, eyes closed, arms raised to the ceiling. She had backed away and never spoke of it again. But now, it seemed that moment had been the beginning of everything. What if the cave wasn't just where the silence lived, but where it called people to listen? The tension in the village grew with each passing day. Technology began to fail, Phones dropped calls, lights flickered, and clocks stopped for no reason. The church bell rang at strange hours, sometimes when no one was near it. A thick fog settled over Belle Mere one night and didn't lift for nearly a day. In the fog, people claimed to hear faint whispers, not in words, but in something older, like memory. And always, in the background, the feeling that something was moving closer. The silence wasn't just returning. It was spreading. The fog didn't lift entirely that next morning. It just hung low over Belle Mere like a blanket, thick and unmoving. The trees along the edge of the village disappeared into it, their tops barely visible. People stayed inside. Some said it was just weather. Others didn't bother pretending anymore. The silence that had once seemed symbolic now felt alive, pressing, watching. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. No birds. No dogs barking. Even the wind had gone still. Inside the chapel, Eliza lit a candle at the altar. Her hands trembled. It was the same way she had done it every Sunday morning for over 20 years, but now the flame seemed smaller, weaker. She glanced at the stained glass above the altar. The image of Saint Cecilia, patroness of music, looked back at her. But something about the expression had changed. She couldn't explain it. It was still glass, still color, but there was something behind the eyes. A deepness. Like the saint was no longer listening, but warning. Daniel entered quietly behind her, carrying a rolled-up map and a small notebook. His eyes were tired, and his voice barely above a whisper. "We found another symbol," he said, "near the old well. That well hadn't been used in decades. It sat at the edge of the forest, overgrown and nearly hidden." He unrolled the map and pointed to it. The symbol carved into the stones near the well was identical to the ones in the cave and the diary pages. A ring with 4 intersecting lines, what Daniel now believed represented the 4 vanished nuns. But this new marking was different, fresh, recent. Someone had been there. Margot joined them minutes later, visibly shaken. She had dreamed again the night before. Only this time, it wasn't the hallway. It was the cave. And she wasn't alone. She said she heard chanting, low and slow. And then, just before waking, she saw Father Benedict. Not like before. This time, his eyes were open, but empty. They made a decision then, without saying it outright. They had to go back to the cave. Not just to find answers, but because something was pulling them toward it. They couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever had begun in 1980 wasn't just repeating, it was reaching a conclusion. They gathered supplies, flashlights, rope, journals, and the only relic left behind by Father Benedict, his rosary. Eliza held it tightly as they stepped into the forest, each of them silent, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fog that trailed them like breath. The journey through the woods took longer this time. The path, which once seemed so clear, now felt unfamiliar. Trees bent in ways they hadn't before. Sounds seemed to come from the wrong direction. They saw movement more than once, shapes in the fog that stayed just out of sight. None of them spoke it aloud, but they all saw the same thing, for figures. Distant, veiled, and standing still. Watching. By the time they reached the cave, the sun had nearly set. The entrance was exactly as before, hidden behind curtains of ivy. But something was different this time. The air was colder. The forest itself seemed to push them forward, as if the silence was done waiting. They entered cautiously. The walls of the cave were damp, and the strange symbols carved into the stone seemed to pulse faintly under their flashlights. When they reached the altar at the back, they stopped. Someone had been there recently. Fresh candles sat beside the old wax drippings. In the center of the stone altar was a journal. It was Father Benedict's. Eliza picked it up with shaking hands. The pages were damp, but readable. His handwriting filled every page, frantic and uneven, as if written in a rush. He spoke of voices that weren't voices, of being shown things in dreams that he couldn't explain. He wrote about the nuns, how he believed they had never died, that they had stepped into something else. Not heaven, not death, but silence, a place between places. He wrote of the threshold, a term that had never come up before. A point within the cave, hidden behind a sealed wall, where the veil between worlds was weakest. And he ended with a warning. If you hear them, do not answer. If you see them, do not follow. If you feel nothing, run. Daniel looked around the cave. There's a wall, he said. Behind the altar. He moved the altar stone aside, revealing a hidden doorframe carved into the rock. Old symbols lined the edges. Some had been scratched out violently. Without thinking, Eliza stepped forward and placed her hand against the stone. The wall was cold, but it gave way slightly. A shift, like something inside had been waiting for that touch. A low sound began. Not from the cave, not from outside, from within them. A vibration, like a hum in their bones. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of something unseen. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passage. Black, damp, and stretching further than their lights could reach. They hesitated, breathing heavy, but they knew there was no turning back. The passage was tight. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the air smelled of old earth and something else, like wet cloth and wax. The silence was deeper here. Their footsteps didn't echo. Their breathing sounded distant, like they weren't entirely there. Then came the whispers. First, faint, then clearer. Not words, but tones. Rising and falling. Familiar. Margot froze. That's the melody, she whispered. From the chapel basement, from the dream. At the end of the passage, they saw it, a circular chamber, perfectly carved, with walls lined in veiled statues. At least, they looked like statues. But they weren't made of stone. They were too lifelike. The veils moved slightly, as if breathing. In the center was a stone platform. For robes lay folded there, neatly arranged. One of them still held a rosary. Eliza moved toward the platform slowly, tears in her eyes. It's them, she said. I know it is. Then the chamber shifted. Not physically, but the atmosphere thickened. A presence entered, heavy and vast. The silence deepened until their thoughts felt muffled. Daniel fell to his knees, clutching his head. Margot stumbled back, her flashlight flickering. The whispering grew louder, not in their ears, but inside their minds. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was Father Benedict. But his eyes weren't his anymore. And behind him, the four veiled women rose. The silence broke, not with sound, but with knowing. And in that moment, the truth they had searched for came rushing in. But it wasn't the kind of truth meant to be known. It was the kind that changes everything. Forever. Eliza couldn't breathe. She didn't know if it was fear or something in the air, but her chest felt tight, like the silence was pressing down on her lungs. Father Benedict stood just inside the chamber's edge, his head tilted slightly, as if studying them. But it wasn't the man they had known. Something about him, his stance, his face, was wrong. His eyes were open, but they held no recognition, no warmth, no panic, just stillness. Behind him, the four veiled women remained completely motionless, hands clasped before them, heads bowed. Their presence was overwhelming. Daniel took a slow step forward, holding the old rosary in one hand like it might protect him. "Father," he asked, his voice cracking, "can you hear me?" The figure blinked. Once. Then his mouth opened slowly, but no words came out. Instead, a sound, a deep, resonant hum, echoed through the stone chamber, and it vibrated in their bones like the cave itself was responding. The veiled women lifted their heads in unison. Margot gasped. "They're not just here," she whispered. "They're waiting." For what? None of them knew. Eliza stepped back, but her foot hit something soft. When she turned to look, she saw what appeared to be another folded robe. But this one was different. It was newer, dustless, and beside it, a candle had already been lit. Margot saw it too. That wasn't here before. She crouched down and reached toward the robe, but as her fingers brushed the edge of the fabric, she froze. Her expression shifted, eyes wide. Her mouth trembled like she wanted to scream, but couldn't. Daniel knelt beside her, shaking her shoulder. "Margot," he said. "What is it?" But she just stared, and then, barely audible, muttered, "I remember." Eliza turned to her, confused. "Remember what?" Margot's voice was like wine through broken glass. There were 5. The chamber went cold. For weeks, they'd focused on the 4 nuns who had vanished. They'd chased every record, every diary, every story connected to them. But Margot, who had been there at the convent, who had lived alongside them, was just now remembering something that had been locked away in her mind. There wasn't just a Sister Magdalena, Agnes, Ruth, and Helena. There had been another. Margot looked up at them now, her eyes brimming with tears. Her name was Sister Eloise. Daniel stood up, stunned. "That name isn't in any of the records." No, Margot said, because she wasn't supposed to be there. She arrived just weeks before the others vanished. Quiet. Strange. The others didn't talk about her much. I thought she left. But she didn't. The fifth robe. The fifth candle. The fifth place. A fifth presence. As soon as the name, Eloise, left Margot's lips, the silence in the chamber changed. It was no longer heavy. It was charged. Alive. And from the far end of the circular room, where no one had noticed a passage before, a soft light began to flicker. They turned toward it, but no one moved. The veiled women remained still, Father Benedict still standing, eyes open but empty. The only thing that had changed was the faint sound coming from the new passage, like the rustle of fabric and a slow shuffle of bare feet on stone. Eliza spoke barely above a whisper. Something's coming. And it was. Out of the new passage came a soft figure, taller than the others, veiled in pure black rather than white. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if every movement had weight. She walked past Father Benedict, past the four sisters, and straight toward the platform in the center. None of them could move. Even breathing felt like a struggle. The black-veiled woman reached the platform and stopped beside the fifth robe. Her hands lifted the veil just slightly, and for the briefest moment, Eliza saw her face. It was Margot's, but older, weathered, with eyes that burned like coals under frozen water. Margot collapsed. Daniel rushed to her side, checking her pulse. She was alive, but unconscious, her breathing shallow. Eliza turned to the figure in black. "What is this? Who are you?" The woman's voice came not from her mouth, but from everywhere. Inside them. "I am what remains. The one who stayed when the others passed through. They chose silence. I became it." Daniel, still kneeling, looked up. "Why now? Why us?" "Because the seal is thin. Because forgetting does not mean undoing. The silence has memory." The chamber began to pulse again with that low, steady hum. The walls seemed to ripple slightly, like waves against stone. Daniel looked at the veiled women and saw that their hands were no longer clasped. They were reaching slowly toward the center. Reaching toward Margot. "We need to go," Eliza whispered. "Now." But the passage behind them was gone. In its place, only more stone. The chamber was closing. The woman in black, Sister Eloise, moved her hand toward Margot's head. Just before she could touch her, Margot's eyes snapped open. But they were no longer her eyes. The expression was calm, peaceful, terrifying. She stood on her own and walked to the platform, standing beside Eloise. Daniel tried to stop her, but Father Benedict stepped in front of him, eyes glowing faintly. Eliza grabbed Daniel's arm. "We can't help her. Not here." The veiled sisters began to chant now, slowly, their voices low and deep, echoing in impossible directions. The hum became louder, filling the space, vibrating through their teeth, their ribs. And then Eloise turned to Eliza directly. "There is always a fifth." Eliza's knees gave out. The memory returned in a flash. She was 13. Her mother had once worked in the convent kitchen. Eliza had visited once, only once. A nun, tall, veiled in black, had taken her hand, led her down a dark hallway, and whispered in her ear, "If the others forget, you will remember. You are mine." Eliza had buried the memory. Now it came roaring back. Her hands trembled as the fifth robe was lifted by unseen hands and placed before her. Eloise took a step forward. Daniel tried to pull Eliza back, shouting something, but she didn't hear it. All she heard was the silence. Not empty, not hollow, but full, and calling her name. Just as she reached for the robe, something cracked overhead. A chunk of rock fell from the ceiling, breaking the illusion. Daniel pulled her back, and the platform flickered, just for a moment, like the light was failing. Eliza gasped, shaken from the trance. Eloise's expression didn't change, but her presence shifted. The silence was angry now. The walls groaned. And from somewhere deeper in the chamber, behind everything, came a sound no one expected. A child's voice, laughing, and then whispering, "You shouldn't have come back." The lights went out. The darkness swallowed them whole. For a moment, there was nothing. No light, no shape, not even sound. Eliza reached out blindly, fingers grasping air, heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't tell if Daniel was still beside her or if the others were even real anymore. The silence felt thicker now, almost physical, like a weight pressing from every direction. And somewhere in that choking void, the child's laughter echoed again, closer, clearer, colder. Then, a spark. Daniel's flashlight flickered weakly to life. It cast a narrow beam that barely reached the stone beneath their feet, but it was enough to show Eliza that they were still in the chamber or some part of it. The statues were gone. The platform, the robes, the veiled sisters, all vanished. In their place stood a ring of dark pillars, each etched with that same haunting symbol, the circle with 4 intersecting lines. And in the middle, Margot stood alone. She was no longer unconscious, no longer afraid. Her posture was calm, composed. She looked different, older, stronger, almost ethereal. The look in her eyes sent a chill through Eliza. It wasn't madness or confusion. It was peace. Absolute, unwavering peace. "I remember everything," Margot said, her voice echoing without an edge. "I remember what they did, and why they left." Daniel stepped toward her. "You're not one of them," he said. "You're not like Eloise." "But I was," she replied softly. "And still am. I was the 5th. I was chosen before I even knew it. They needed 5 to open the threshold, and I was always meant to complete it." Eliza shook her head, confused. "Then why were you left behind?" Margot looked directly at her. "Because I resisted. I didn't want to disappear. I broke the link, for a while. But when we came back to this place, everything fell back into place. The silence doesn't forget." Daniel looked around at the pillars. "Where is Father Benedict? Where are the others?" "They've passed through," Margot answered. The veil opened the moment the 5th candle was lit. But that wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As she spoke, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, softly at first, then more intensely. Cracks spread from the center of the stone floor like veins. From within those cracks, a faint, golden light leaked upward. It wasn't warm. It was strange. Wrong. Like a memory you're not supposed to have. Eliza took a step back. "We need to leave. Now." But the air shifted, and the way they came in had sealed again. The stone had reformed, solid and unmoving. Then came the sound again, the child's voice, this time clearer, less playful. "I told you not to come back." From behind one of the pillars, a figure stepped out. Small, barely 10 years old, wearing a simple white tunic. Eyes like deep wells, empty and old. The child stared at them, unblinking. Daniel whispered, "Who are you?" The child smiled faintly. "I was the first." Eliza's throat went dry. "First what?" "The first sacrifice. The first silence. They took me when the village still believed the forest had secrets. Before the convent was built. Before the prayers stopped." The child looked at Margot. "You weren't supposed to break the circle." And then Margot began to scream, not in pain, but in defiance. Her hands lifted toward the ceiling as light burst from the cracks beneath her feet. The ring of symbols on the floor pulsed, glowing brighter, and the pillars began to hum. Eliza and Daniel were thrown to the ground as the chamber erupted in light and sound. The silence shattered, finally, and was replaced by a ringing that pierced every part of their skulls. They saw images flash through their minds. The 4 nuns kneeling in prayer, their hands raised in surrender. Father Benedict digging into the cave wall with bare fingers. Margot as a young girl, watching from behind a curtain as Sister Eloise whispered to someone unseen. Then, just as suddenly, the noise stopped. The light faded. Eliza blinked, slowly pushing herself up. The chamber was still. Daniel groaned beside her, bleeding from a small cut near his eye. What just happened? Margot stood where she had been, but she had changed. Her skin was pale, her eyes distant. The glow beneath the floor had vanished. The pillars were dark again. She looked at them with something like sadness. "It's done," she said. "The veil has been closed. The others, they're gone. Forever now." Eliza stared at her. "You stopped it." Margot nodded once. "I stopped them from taking more. The silence will sleep." Daniel reached for her hand, but she didn't take it. "You can come back with us," he said. "I'm already gone," she replied. "I was gone long before you found the cave." Before Eliza could protest, the stone behind them cracked again, but this time it wasn't a threat. A new passage opened. The air that flowed in was fresh, real, the smell of forest and pine. Their way out. Eliza looked at Margot. "Come with us. Please." But Margot only smiled. Tell them what happened here. Tell them the silence has a memory, and it watches. The chamber began to collapse. Not violently, just slowly disintegrating, as if it had only been held together by belief. Daniel grabbed Eliza's hand and pulled her toward the exit. The moment they crossed the threshold, the passage behind them sealed for good. They emerged into the forest just as dawn began to break. The fog was gone. The trees were still. The air felt normal again. They turned around, but the rock wall was just that, a wall. No symbols. No markings. Just stone and moss. Back in the village, the silence had lifted. Birds sang. Dogs barked. People emerged from their homes as if waking from a long sleep. Something had shifted, even if they didn't understand what. Eliza and Daniel never spoke publicly about what they saw in the cave. But they never stopped watching the tree line. Never stopped listening for the quiet. Years passed. Then one morning, decades later, a letter arrived at the chapel addressed to Eliza. No return name. Just a white envelope with a small, hand-drawn symbol in the corner, a circle with 5 lines. Inside was a single photograph. It was a recent picture, taken in a remote village across the ocean. In the background, barely noticeable, stood a tall woman in a black veil, holding the hand of a small child. The child was smiling. The back of the photo had only 5 words. The silence remembers its own. The photo stayed with Eliza for a long time. Tucked inside a drawer beside her bed, it never faded, never yellowed. She studied it often, not obsessively, but thoughtfully, like she was still trying to understand what it really meant. Over the years, she came to believe that the story hadn't truly ended in that chamber. It had simply changed shape, passed from one place to another, like wind traveling through trees. And though she never heard the silence the same way again, she could feel its edges sometimes, late at night, or when a chill passed through a room for no reason. Daniel moved away after the events in the cave, but they stayed in touch. He built a quiet life for himself in a different town, far from the forests and far from questions no one else could understand. Occasionally, they'd talk about what happened, though not in full. Some things were just too strange, too layered, too sacred to explain, even between the two of them. But one thing they always agreed on, it was real. Every part of it. The symbols, the voices, the vanishing of the nuns, and the presence that lived in the silence. Back in the village, Father Benedict's disappearance raised questions, but most people accepted that he'd wandered too far into the woods and never returned. The official reports were vague. The church didn't push for an investigation. Eliza suspected they knew more than they let on. She often wondered if someone in the higher ranks had received a letter like hers. Maybe even before she did. The church grounds were eventually sold off and turned into a community center. The old convent building, once crumbling and quiet, was restored brick by brick, but never fully reopened. Every time they tried to renovate the eastern wing, the part nearest the woods, tools would vanish, strange noises would be heard, and workers would fall mysteriously ill. Eventually, that section was left alone, closed off, as if the silence had chosen a new place to rest. The missing nuns were never found. Their names faded from public records, just as they had almost 30 years earlier. But Eliza made sure to keep them alive in her own way. She wrote their stories, not as ghost tales or horror fiction, but as accounts of women who gave everything in the service of something no one fully understood. She didn't paint them as victims. She portrayed them as protectors, guardians of something ancient. Their faces stayed with her, the calm expressions beneath the veils, the way their hands moved in unison, and the sound of their chants echoing in the chamber. It had been terrifying, yes, but also strangely beautiful. And Margot, her fate remained the hardest to accept. There were moments when Eliza wondered if she'd imagined the whole thing, if grief or fear had twisted the events in her memory. But then she'd recall Margot's voice, steady, resolute, as she said, "I was the 5th." The words felt etched into her bones. She knew they were real. Sometimes, on long walks through quiet neighborhoods or while traveling to new towns, Eliza would catch sight of someone who looked a little too familiar. A tall figure in black at the corner of a market. A flash of white robes through a train window. She never chased them, never asked questions, but her breath would catch every time. Years passed quietly. Eliza eventually retired and settled into a small town near the coast. She took comfort in the sea. The rhythm of the waves reminded her that even chaos had a cycle. She still wrote, mostly reflections and short essays about memory, belief, and the unknown. A few were published in small journals. One piece, titled The Shape of Silence, gained a bit of attention online. Readers described it as haunting, yet strangely peaceful. Most thought it was fiction. Eliza didn't correct them. One spring morning, while sorting through old files, she found the original map Daniel had drawn of the cave system. The pencil lines had faded, but the symbols were still visible, especially the circle with 5 lines. She traced them gently with her finger and smiled, remembering how they had once held so much fear. Now, they were a part of her story, a reminder of the boundaries between worlds, between what is seen and unseen. She never returned to the forest, not because she was afraid, but because she knew that some places aren't meant to be visited twice. They give you what you need, answers, closure, or sometimes just the right questions, and then they rest. One day, much later, she received another letter. No return address. Just a single sheet of paper and another photograph. This time, the image was of a stone wall deep in a different country, South America, maybe, or Eastern Europe. Hard to say. In the corner of the image was a carved symbol. The same one. Faint but unmistakable. On the back of the photo, a message, "The silence walks." But it no longer waits. Eliza folded the note carefully and tucked it into the back of the photo album. She didn't feel dread. Just a deep knowing that the story she had once been a part of was still moving, still unfolding somewhere else. And that someone, someday, would find themselves at the edge of that same threshold. Maybe they'd be ready. Maybe they wouldn't. But they would know the signs. Eliza stood at her window, watching the waves roll in. She breathed in the salt air and felt peace, not because everything had been explained, but because she had stopped needing an explanation. Life didn't always give you neat answers. Sometimes, it gave you stories. And sometimes, those stories asked you to remember something older than truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she closed her eyes and whispered softly, not a prayer, not a plea. Just a memory of a name. Margot. The sea answered with silence. And that, at last, was enough.